Welcome to episode number 218, where I'm speaking with Dr. Shamini Jain about her new book, Healing Ourselves, Biofield Science and the Future of Health. We talk about the original separation of alternative medicine and conventional medicine, how this disempowerment has led to an epidemic of disease and addiction. And now with the evidence-based study of the biofield, how modern medicine is embracing biofield healing. So please stay tuned. Welcome to the Elements of Ayurveda podcast. I'm your host, Colette, and I hope to educate and empower you to take charge of your health and well-being, preventing disease in the body and mind so that you can thrive in life. I will be sharing the holistic teachings of Ayurveda, which is the ancient healing tradition from India. Now, if you're new to Ayurveda, I recommend listening to the first couple of episodes where I do an introduction to Ayurveda and the mind-body types. And if you like the content, please be sure to subscribe or follow the podcast so the new episodes will automatically download for you. Also, you may want to check out my private Elements community, which is away from social media. It's a safe space for like-minded people to come together, to connect, to share, to support each other, and to continue the conversation from the podcast episodes. Check out the link in the show notes or visit my website, elementshealingandwellbeing.com, and just click on the community tab. And I hope to connect with you there. Thanks for listening, and now here's a new episode. Hello, and welcome back to the Elements of Ayurveda podcast. Today, I'm very happy to introduce you to Dr. Shamini Jain, who is a psychologist, scientist, and social entrepreneur. She is the founder and CEO of the Consciousness and Healing Initiative, a collaborative accelerator that connects scientists, health practitioners, educators, and artists to help lead humanity to heal ourselves. Her pioneering research in meditation, biofield healing, and psychoneuroimmunology has been featured in Time, U.S. News & World Report, and CNN. Dr. Jain obtained her BA in Neuroscience and Behavior at Columbia University and her PhD in Clinical Psychology and Psychoneuroimmunology at the UC San Diego State University. She conducted her clinical internship at the La Jolla VA Hospital and her postdoctoral fellowship at UCLA's Division of Cancer Prevention and Control Research. She is also adjunct faculty to UC San Diego and a member of UC San Diego Center for Integrative Medicine. Dr. Jain's latest book is called Healing Ourselves, Biofield Science and the Future of Health. And this is what we are going to discuss today. Dr. Jain, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Colette. It's so nice to be with you.
Likewise. And I find your work fascinating and your book was so interesting. And I think the audience will be very interested in this conversation as well. So I'm dying to delve in. I have lots to ask you. So I'm going to get right into it, if that's okay.
You bet.
So in your book, you're essentially bringing together alternative medicine and conventional medicine. And you say that we don't have to choose, but rather putting the pieces back together so that we can expand further. And we understand from ancient teachings like that of Ayurveda that the concept of holistic health and the mind-body environment connection was understood thousands of years ago. So why do you think, or how did it become separated into this alternative and conventional medicine that we have today?
It's such a great question, Colette, and it really stems back to worldview and our tendency as human beings to where when we have a hammer, everything becomes a nail. And, I talk about this a bit, as you know, in the book, Healing Ourselves. We had certain health issues back in the day that we couldn't solve, pathogenic issues, things, people were getting sick, and the current methods weren't effective. And this is back, in the 17th century, and when people were really, in some ways, tuned into the idea of the body-mind connection. Even in the Western world, you had the discussion on humors and things like that, which, of course, as you know, parallel some of the understandings in Ayurveda. So some of that ancient tradition, even in the West, was there. But we weren't able to figure everything out in terms of when people got sick, how to right that issue. And what we found was, when, for example, penicillin was discovered, and we realized that we could use something called an antibiotic, and it seemed to have this effect on bacterial infections, people would get better. We weren't driving spirits out of the body necessarily. We were using these antibiotics. The whole idea of pathogenesis really began to take wind. Well, what is that? It's the idea that there is some germ that is kind of outside of me that's causing disharmony. And when I take this drug or this agent outside of me, I can kill it, right? And when I kill it, then I get better. So there was some truth to that. Obviously, penicillin was a godsend. A lot of these medicines can be godsends. But then we started looking at things only with that view. It was like, it was one or the other right away, right? So all of a sudden, we come to the present time where I think I might mention in the book, I have a professor at the university who's telling me that Ayurveda is primitive medicine. As you can imagine, that floored me, to hear this tenured professor, well-respected professor, at a major university say, oh, well, Ayurveda and, the idea of energy and all that, that's just primitive medicine. Those are just primitive concepts. So the question is it? Did penicillin and sort of the trajectory that we're on right now, with the focus on pharmacological agents, surgery, all of these things, which of course definitely seem to have their place. Does that just sort of mean that everything we did before was useless or primitive? I think you would probably agree that that's not the case, right? So part of the issue has been, as human beings, we just are in this divide and conquer mentality, right? And so because of that, we've never really looked at the whole system. Now, of course, in our ancient traditional medicines like Ayurveda, we've always seen the body, mind, spirit as a whole system. Not only are we connected with our spirit and our emotions, and this has an effect on our health, but we're connected to our environment and the change of seasons, all of these things that happen in our environment deeply affect our personal health, because there was always this cosmology of connection. So when we lost that cosmology of connection because of an overemphasis on pathogenesis, that's where we became divided. And what's very cool, I think, now is we can look at traditional Western science, to speak of it in that way, right? And we're starting to realize that the Western scientific models are bringing us back into the direction of holism for health. And we can see this, for example, when we look at the omics work. We're now looking at the whole microbiome. We're looking at the whole genome, the whole proteome. So what is that? We're not just looking at pieces of the puzzle now. We're trying to put all those pieces together and look at the entire system of function. And it's really not that different, for example, from Ayurveda, right? We can say, well, we looked at those things phenotypically. We've been doing that for thousands of years. When we do pulse and we do tongue and all that, that's telling us something about the phenotype, right? That's telling us something about our clinical presentation. We maybe didn't have the same fancy tools that we have now to look at it from a metabolomic standpoint. But what's really neat, and you may know this, is now we can bridge those languages. It's really neat because we have scientists, for example, in the Netherlands at the University of Leiden that have done really interesting work looking at metabolomic profiles, for example, and relating those to Chinese medicine constitutions. And that has been really meaningful because when they do that, they're finding that looking at the connection of both the Chinese medicine diagnosis and the metabolomics is telling us something about how different constitutions, for example, in rheumatoid arthritis, might respond differently to certain types of medication. So we're finally starting to put these pieces back together. And of course, psychoneuroimmunology and this area that I call, and many of us call, Biofield Science, the study of energy and information, are really helping us put together these pieces of how does my spiritual well-being affect my physical health, as well as my emotional health, my interpersonal health. So it's a really exciting time, I think, in science where we're really looking at all of these different facets of our humanness.
It is a great time. And finally, it's coming back to wholeness again. And that's our nature, isn't it? With so many facets of life, is the pendulum swings far in one direction and we realize we've gone off course and now we need to bring it back to center. So that's how I feel. We've just kind of swung out too far, maybe a bit of ego involved there and reductionist thinking, but now we're coming back, which is the important thing. And you can see how with Western medicine and using antibiotics and thinking of this illness as invaders in our body, that this caused a dissociation with what was going on in our body, and also a dissociation with the healing process, because we're given something external, a medicine to take to heal us. So it's all very external, and the client or the patient isn't exactly involved in the healing process.
It's so true. It's absolutely true. We abdicated our power to a certain degree. And there's no reason for that. And it's not the fault of the medicine. It's the way we use it, exactly. Right? So antibiotics were a great thing. We 100%. Overprescribed them, yes. Right? We overprescribed them. And then, and we all know about the mental health debacle, the chronic disease debacle, because we abdicated our power.
Yes.
And, we can point fingers at the pharmaceutical companies, and, we know that there's history there of kind of an overfocus, especially here on the United States, where the profit margins are so high. You have vested interests that end up driving this overemphasis on physicalism, as you say, reductionism. But ultimately, each of us have to sort of sit with ourselves, sit with the data. I mean, this is why I'm so excited to share what the data is, because not everybody knows about the data behind self-healing, behind things like placebo, behind energy healing. So when we actually do get to sit with that data and see how real our consciousness really is at facilitating our healing, then it places us right back in the center of the power dynamic, right? Exactly. It's really up to us.
Yes, absolutely. And yes, that information can really empower us and know that we can be an active participant, care of our own health and not having to outsource it, which is amazing. So I'm looking forward to getting into all that data and talking more about Biofield Science. But before we do, I'm fascinated by your story as well as your personal journey, because we see from your bio, you have amazing educational background. So what led you to this path of wanting to bring together alternative medicine and conventional medicine?
It was really, again, seeing the gaps. I think coming as an East Indian young woman who was born and raised in the United States, but of East Indian heritage, both my parents came from India. They've been in the U.S. now about 60 years. So I was born here in the South, actually, in Greenville, South Carolina. And right away, I noticed, well, my religion isn't like my friends. They were all Baptist Christian. I would go to church with them. They would come to our house and ask questions. And so it was always sort of learning that there's just different points of view all around. But when I went to school, I realized we weren't talking about consciousness. We weren't talking about spirituality. And then later in college, I realized just from an intuitive standpoint, having practiced meditation and knowing something about the mind, and of course, reading a lot of the ancient texts from Hinduism and Vedanta and Jainism on the nature of consciousness, I wondered why we didn't talk about that when we studied things like the brain. Right. At that point in the early 90s, it was like, oh, this part of the brain lights up when I lift my hand or something. That's what we were doing at that time. And I was like, well, that's cool, but there's more to it than that. Yeah. And so there was always sort of this seeking to bridge the worlds because, being an East Indian woman, I think in the US and growing up here, I realized there were bridges to be built and science and medicine were no exception. So the philosophies and the understandings behind so many different models and practices of spirituality and medicine across the world were just not really reflected in anything that we were learning in school. Again, it was really focused more on that model of physicalism, reductionism. And, I remember when my early days as a graduate student, I always interested in energy and vibration, but I also studied meditation. And actually my most widely cited study to date is the most boring study. I think it was the most obvious study. And it was examining mindfulness meditation, comparing it with relaxation to see whether there were any real differences between those. Is there something special and unique about mindfulness, essentially? It was the first ever randomized controlled trial that compared mindfulness meditation with something else, which I find shocking because this was done in the early 2000s. Anyway, what I realized being in that group of even meditation researchers back then was that even in those circles, you couldn't talk about consciousness. You couldn't talk about energy.
Wow.
It was okay to study meditation in terms of its effects on, symptoms and anxiety and depression and things like that, which is great. But when people, later on as a clinician, when, veterans and other patients were coming to me and reporting different experiences, I realized we weren't giving them any context for it, right?
Yeah.
We were literally told not to talk about energy and things like that in some of the trainings because it wasn't secular enough. No. So, again, I think coming from a different culture, I really questioned why we were doing things the way we were. What is this monocultural ethnocentrism that I'm seeing in science and medicine? And what are the costs to society when we move forward in that sort of ethnocentric view?
Yeah.
So I think from that point of view, coming from a different culture where I was raised in a different way to think than what was mainstream, I always wondered why it had to be one or the other, you know?
Yeah.
Like maybe both are correct. Maybe we should be looking at the whole picture.
Yeah, it's fascinating. And, we're missing out on so much by not having the whole picture. And we have so much wisdom there, ancient wisdom that can help us. So this coming together now, and I think Western science and Western medicine opening up to this holistic view is exactly what we need, because you mentioned in your book, we've never been more physically and psychologically sick as we are today. And you said in the book that the answer is simple because we're disempowered. And like we mentioned earlier, we're no longer playing an active role in our healing, and that disconnection is leading to an epidemic of disease and addiction. I'd love for you to talk further on this. We mentioned it earlier, but if you could discuss that further, how that disempowerment is really causing us to not be in touch with our own healing powers and our consciousness.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's make it really concrete. As we know, some of the biggest killers, really, not just, sappers of quality of life, but actually killers globally are things like heart disease and diabetes, right? So if we go with the party line, and now things are shifting. I was so happy to see, shifts even in my doctor's office, even in the allopathic doctor's office on, how we can prevent things like diabetes and heart disease. Well, that's fairly new, actually. Because just 10, 20 years ago, the party line is you need to take this medication. This is what you need to do. And there wasn't a sense of, oh, wow, what I eat is going to affect my cardiovascular health, whether I'm exercising and how much is going to affect that, my mood, my stress level, all these things. So because for so long we haven't emphasized how important all of these whole person factors are. Our emotional health, our interpersonal health, that is our relationships, our diet, our movement, right? We have disease on epic proportions and all preventable. There's no such thing as my family has diabetes and therefore I will have it. No, it can be my family has been carrying diabetes and I need to look very deeply at all of the factors that are driving a diabetes pattern so that I can interrupt that pattern. And, I think many of us now are living proof of that. It takes work, though. It takes some vigilance. It takes some questioning. It takes some guidance and coaching. I mean, that's why we have all of these beautiful approaches like Ayurveda that are there to help guide us so that we can see, how do I come back into harmony with myself and my environment? But certainly if we don't do that and we keep going that road of just pure physicalism, reductionism, everything will be fixed by a pill. Well, that's not working. Yeah. It hasn't been working. And, the mental health debacle is another example of that, where we still have for example, cancer patients, where we have the data to show that when a cancer patient gets counseling early on in the process after diagnosis, before, for example, surgery or radiation or anything else, they have better outcomes. They have actually better physical outcomes. But do we have in place in the healthcare system where every single cancer patient has the opportunity to receive psychotherapy? No, we don't. Only some cancer centers do that. But it is catching on. And this is where the evidence base is so important. And this is where, the work of my nonprofit comes in. I founded and run a nonprofit called the Consciousness and Healing Initiative. And we describe ourselves as a collaborative to foster the science and practice of healing. We bring together scientists along with healing practitioners and educators and even artists to share what we know about healing and share that out with the world. And one of the things that we do, of course, we do research, but we also share the evidence behind all kinds of research, because the most important thing is that people need to know that this is evidence-based. When we're talking about whole person healing, energy healing, meditation, yoga, all of these things have a strong evidence base. That's really what drove me to write the book, Healing Ourselves. As you know, Colette, it's pretty strongly based in evidence.
Yes.
I think there are over 700 peer-reviewed published references in there. We cover, all of these different aspects of things like placebo, mind-body practices, what we call here in the West mind-body practices, which are really mind-body-spirit practices, right? Like yoga, different forms of meditation, Tai Chi, Qigong, and energy healing. The evidence is clear that these practices have strong effects on our body mind and can help us prevent disease, reduce symptoms, and promote more joy in our lives, right? So it's time to get everyone on the same page with the evidence base, so that we can more readily get these practices into healthcare. It is important that patients, for example, who go to the ER are given choices. And so now we see this in some of the more progressive hospitals here in the US, at least, there are options for patients to get acupuncture for acute pain when they go into the ER, for example. It's not happening a lot, but it is starting to happen. And that's because we're building that evidence base.
Yeah. And like you said, this is why the book is so important, because for people who have that mindset, like you talked about that tenured lecture, that thought process of, that's primitive ancient wisdom, but with the evidence-based documentation, they are more likely to take that on board and implement these practices.
Absolutely. At the Consciousness and Healing Initiative, we say we're bringing healing therapies into healthcare and into self-care. There's two main trajectories for us to increase human flourishing and thriving, and those are the ways. So the evidence base becomes very important to put these things into the clinics and hospitals. Right. And the good news is, as you know, for prevention, we can start working with all of this now. We don't have to wait till we get sick or even go see a doctor to start putting these practices into place. That's why the third part of the book is the healing keys, right? Because what I've done in that third part is say, okay, with everything we've learned, how can we take the best of what we've learned from placebo, energy healing, meditation, and put it into a daily routine for ourselves so that we can stay healthy, stay thriving, stay connected with our spirit, which is where the healing really happens.
I love it. Yeah. And the person can be really in tune with their own subtle energy in the body and realize early days if there's an imbalance and be empowered to take charge of that. So true. So we talked about, Western medicine, and in the book you talked about Western medicine understanding the connection between the immune system and our brain via psychoneuroimmunology. So can you explain more about this movement and how that the Western medical system was paying more attention to this? I know in the book you said that a lot of people rejected it, but I think, is it fair to say that this was the start of that understanding? Okay.
Absolutely. And I gave that example in the book because it's where psychoneuroimmunology was, say, 50 years ago when it first began. People didn't even believe that our emotions affected our immunity. They thought the whole thing was laughable. And so I liken kind of what's happening in Biofield Science, which we'll get to, with what happened with psychoneuroimmunology. You had groups of researchers and medical doctors that said, there's something here. I'm noticing a pattern in the emotional responses of my patients and the relationship with their health. That's what the doctors were seeing. And these researchers were seeing these interesting things where they suspected that the brain was connected to the immune system. Now, that might seem really basic to us today, but it's to remind us that 50 years ago, that was almost considered heresy. Right. The idea that your immune system was connected to your brain was just not something we thought of. Why? Because we didn't look at the body holistically, right? We didn't look at it as an interconnected system. So like I said, that is changing. And it happened because a group of dedicated researchers got together and said, we know everybody else thinks we're crazy. We know we can't get funding for this work yet, but we think there's something here. So they collaborated. And that's what we do in the Consciousness and Healing Initiative. We bring researchers together to collaborate in the biofield, which is the next frontier of this. But in psychoneuroimmunology, what we discovered was, and as you know, I kind of give very clear examples of some of the first groundbreaking studies that were done in psychoneuroimmunology that helped us understand that our brain and our immune system are deeply connected. And our brain and our hormone system are connected. And our emotions can affect all of these systems, and they do. So now we're looking at this brain-body connection to help us more deeply understand how our gut microbiome, very relevant to Ayurveda, right? How is it that our gut microbiome could affect our mood, could potentially influence what are called mental, emotional disorders like depression and anxiety and even Parkinson's disease, right? So there's this deep mind-body connection that psychoneuroimmunology has helped us uncover, and that is now mainstream science. CNI, or psychoneuroimmunology, is mainstream science. There are whole journals, there are whole journals dedicated to it. There are whole special issues in the best of journals looking at these neuroimmune connections. Now, here's the question. We can look at these neuroimmune connections, and a lot of people are looking at this as a way of developing new drugs. Well, now I'm going to develop new drugs to kind of work with the microbiome in the gut and influence the brain function. Sure. Or we could look at diet, right?
Right.
Or we could look at mind-body practices. So, now we're finding some interesting work that's just starting to be done, looking even at meditation and its effects on the microbiome. I have been wanting to forward studies for some time, actually, with energy healing in the microbiome. And people will say, well, how could that be possible? Well, because if the body is an interconnected system, and we understand that our biofield or our energy field can actually regulate our blood chemistry, right? Do we understand all the ways that it does yet? No. Do we know that influencing our biofield can have effects down to the cellular level? Yes. Some of the data is already suggesting this in animals as well as in humans. Then, we look at that core of psychoneuroimmunology as a way of us understanding how our consciousness gets under the skin and fosters healing.
I'm going to interrupt this conversation just for a moment, because if you're inspired by this conversation with Dr. Jain to start taking charge of your health and well-being and learning how to pacify the body and mind and prevent disease, then I have a couple of things I want to share with you. The first is that I have a discounted Digestive Reset Cleanse. It's a group cleanse starting January 21st. Now, even though it's a group cleanse, it's tailored to you because I have a 90-minute one-to-one consultation with you online. And that's where I gather all the information about your current health status. And then I tailor the recipes, the mindfulness, the self-care, the yoga, etc., to your needs and to your lifestyle. Now, if that date of January 21st isn't convenient for you, you can do a private cleanse. It's the same cleanse format. You get to choose your own dates. So just check out the link in the show notes or visit my website, elementshealingandwellbeing.com. I also want to let you know that this episode is sponsored by Kerala Ayurveda Academy. The world is remembering the ancient traditions, and our planet needs people like you to spread their wisdom. If you're passionate about holistic health, Kerala Ayurveda Academy welcomes you to study online or in person. You'll gain all the tools you need to upgrade your lifestyle, align with nature, and inspire others to do the same. To learn more, visit keralaayurveda.us/courses, and you'll find that link in the show notes also. Okay, let's go back to my conversation with Dr. Jain. And so let's follow up on that. You mentioned the biofield healing, and you say that this is the missing link between consciousness and healing. And it's really interesting. In Ayurveda, we talk about the koshas, or the sheaths of the body. And so can you explain to us the biofield? Is it correct to say it's the energetic body?
It's a great question. Mm-hmm. And let me say that the biofield is more of a perspective than a precise definition. It's like describing consciousness, you know? Mm-hmm. Everybody has a different view. So what's neat about the biofield, and why did we even invent this term? You know, Western scientists love to create new terms. The reason we created the term biofield, and that was coined at the National Institutes of Health about two or three decades ago now, is because we wanted a term that helped us understand that there's energy and information moving through living systems. So we can talk about the biofield of a cell, the biofield of a person, and even the biofield of an earth. Okay. And we can look at the interactions between those biofields. So for example, the human earth connection, the biofield connection between the humans and the earth. We look at that in grounding studies, for example. There's actually a bioelectric connection between humans and the earth. Of course, we've known this in Ayurveda and in so many traditions for so long. So it includes things like electromagnetic vibrations that we can measure, even things like the EKG, right, would be considered a biofield because we're measuring the biofield of the heart. But it also includes those subtle aspects that you mentioned, prana, chi, the different types of prana, the koshas. That would all be understood to be part of the biofield umbrella, if you will. Now, the reason why we're trying to bring attention to this area is because in Western science, we focused so much on the mind, and it's beautiful. We've learned so much about the mind and the brain as a way of looking at the mind. As you know, in Ayurveda and in so many traditions, we talk about the mental and the vital. So yes, the biofield and our discussions and exploration of it in a way are meant to help us understand a little bit more of the effects of what we would call the pranamaya kosha, right, on the body. But truly, even the manomaya kosha, right, the mental sheath, the anandamaya kosha, these are all in a way part of the biofield because these are fields of energy and information that guide our health. So from that perspective, I would say the biofield, while at this point, we're focused more on the study of prana and the vital energy body. It's not that the mental body isn't part of the biofield, right?
Sure.
Or even the physical body. It's bringing back the study of energy and information to, again, reintegrate ourselves and understand that it's not just our mind that matters, but it's our energy that matters. And ultimately, it's the marriage of those two that really helps us to foster health.
It's wonderful to see that happening. So how does modern medicine, or how, for example, would you work with the biofield?
There are many ways of looking at this. It's so much fun, actually. There's just so many ways people are exploring the biofield. So as I mentioned, you know, some people are just looking at the biofields of cells and they're manipulating voltage gradients across cell membranes and looking at that for regenerative medicine purposes. So if you look at the work, for example, of Michael Levin at Tufts University and his Center for Regenerative Medicine there, he's literally just taking energy, putting it into cells in different ways, and he's found that he can grow new neural tissue. Wow. That's a way of working with a biofield. So that's, you know, sort of more of a, you know, not necessarily reductionist, but I'm putting known amounts of energy in and I'm looking at these downstream effects.
Right.
Now, when we look at the more spiritual and holistic practices, some of the work that I have done has been, for example, running randomized controlled trials, looking at the effects of biofield healing practices like laying on of hands, healing touch, Reiki, these types of things, right? These more modern practices, you can say, on patients. If a patient receives hands-on healing, for example, does it affect their cancer-related fatigue? Does it reduce their fatigue? Does it affect their hormone function? Well, I found that it has. I published those studies in great journals. That particular study was published in the journal Cancer, widely read by oncologists, to show that, hey, we can do these randomized, placebo-controlled studies looking at energy healing, essentially, keeping all these things constant, looking at placebo variables, looking at, all kinds of other factors that could explain the effects. And yet we see this persistent effect of energy healing that seems to be unique for patients in terms of reducing their symptoms and improving even their physiological outcomes. So as you know, I talk about a lot of this research and the stories behind them for many of my researchers, because I'm not the only one doing this research, right? There are many researchers now at major universities that are looking at these healing therapies. And that's part of the way we look at the biofield as well. And then there are some people that are starting to look at things like, can we measure energy emanations off of healers? And I would say there's definitely some interesting work being done there. We're nowhere near the robustness that we need to really look and see, are there reliable electromagnetic emanations that come off of healers, and what do those emanations mean? In some healers, we don't see those emanations, and in some healers, we do, right? But in all of these healers, we see effects on clinical outcomes. So there are a lot of missing pieces. There's a lot of really fascinating and wonderful discovery, to put together that whole, and I don't like this word, but I'll use it, the whole mechanism of action. How does a person foster healing in another person? To date, we have over 425 clinical studies of biofield healing with patients. So if someone says there's not data, that's actually not true. And our systematic reviews so far show that biofield healing, or this energy healing, has strong effects on reducing pain for many different patients. And there's evidence for other things too, as I mentioned, symptomatology in cancer, dementia, reducing behavioral symptoms of dementia. And there's strong effects on physiology. I will just mention, and as you know, Colette, I mentioned this in the book because there's some very exciting research that's being done now, not only just with patients, but also with animal research. And we're finding that biofield healing can affect tumor shrinkage in mouse models of cancer, tumor metastasis, or that is the spread of cancer through the body in these mouse models of cancer. These are the same mouse models of cancer that are used when we study drugs. Only now we're seeing that the effects that we're seeing on the physiology, down to cytokine levels, down to changes in inflammatory cytokines and even cell signaling, protein kinase levels, these are being found with energy, not with drugs.
Right.
So the effects are very real. But there is much more to discover.
And you did give some great examples in the book. You talked about that young girl who with a brain tumor.
Yes.
Can you share an example with us here of evidence-based change?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, as I mentioned, all of those studies that I mentioned are definitely evidence-based change. Those are, carefully controlled, peer-reviewed, published studies of biofield healing that are out there in the scientific literature and, that I've referenced in the book. What we find, for example, with the story of Mira, who you mentioned, who I talk about in the book in the beginning, is that these real-world stories of patients who seem to have been cured by energy healing for things like cancer, they're not well documented in the literature. That is, there is some documentation of things like spontaneous remission, and certainly, the Institute of Noetic Sciences and my friend Kelly Turner, who wrote the book Radical Remission, they're doing their best to try to catalog these stories of remission, because they do happen, and often they happen related to spiritual experiences or connections with healers, and other work, as well, holistic work that's done. But often the doctors aren't really writing those cases up in the literature. So that's one of the reasons why we conducted the studies that we do, because these randomized controlled trials are considered to be, top level evidence in healthcare. So when we run these larger trials with hundreds of patients, we can come to some more strong definitive conclusions. But I would say that, for people who do have these experiences of healing, profound healing, if they can encourage their doctors to write up these case reports, they're very meaningful as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And Mira had a wonderful, because she had a brain tumor, and through distance energy healing, she's now a healthy teenager today, right?
Absolutely. They discovered her brain tumor at the age of 2. It was a complete shock, and she's now 20 years old. I actually did an interview because their case is not documented, and these are friends of mine. I did an interview with them, and it's freely available on our YouTube channel. If people go to the Consciousness and Healing Initiative YouTube channel, you'll find all kinds of goodies there. There's lots of really wonderful interviews with luminaries that people know, like Deepak Chopra and many others. But there's also an interview with Mira and her father herself. And I really encourage people to watch it. It's just a very authentic conversation with them about their healing journey and everything that they still go through, because Mira actually did suffer developmental delays after getting radiation. When they first found out that she had the tumor, the first thing the parents did was go for radiation and surgery. They were able to get the tumor out and they radiated. She got developmental delays as a result. But when the tumor recurred, it was in a place of their brainstem where they said they couldn't operate. And that's where, they found the energy healer. Yeah. And, she's alive today. And the doctors, quite frankly, said flat out, it's a miracle. We don't understand it. But she is a living example of what the healing process and path looks like, because it really is an everyday thing.
Absolutely. And we all have this power within us. It's just about tapping into that again and empowering ourselves to believe in that everything in our lives affects our health, and that energy, keeping that energy vital is so important.
Yes.
And talking about vital, I had a chapter in your book about the stain of vitalism. And I'd love for you to talk about this a bit. And as we finish up here, talk about what is the future of medicine, and what do you see in your optimistic outlook and in your work that you're doing as the future of medicine?
Thank you so much, Colette. These are great questions. So what is the stain of vitalism? As I alluded to, when we started going in this direction of pathogenesis and what we call reductionism, which means, we're really just focusing on the physical body and the physical aspects of being, we began to lose this sense of our spirituality, our energy, these types of things. And in science, what happened was we got so excited about finding the molecular mechanisms that if people started talking about things like life force or even things in the bioelectromagnetic areas, they were dismissed. So, it was soon that, people basically thought that people who claimed what we call vitalism, the idea that there is a vital life force that exists in healthy beings, or in all beings, rather, all living systems. That idea was so dismissed that people just started thinking that these are lazy scientists. We can explain everything down to molecular mechanisms. So again, that sort of either or thinking that, if you're a vitalist, that means you can't trace molecular mechanisms. Well, that's not really true. We're tracing molecular mechanisms in energy healing. So it's not really an either or. You could explore the bioelectromagnetic and biofield, even the subtle aspects of energy and information in the biology, and still be precise in the way that you're doing that. So we are trying to bring the biofield and biofield science back into the conversation in science and medicine, because we feel like these are very powerful discoveries that are being made that do ultimately point us in the direction of the power of our consciousness for healing, right? So they deserve to be part of the scientific inquiry. This does not have to be relegated to something that we have to tinker around outside of our labs and keep quiet and keep undercover.
Yes, indeed. And like you said, they need to be documented and shared so that there's more of an understanding.
Yes.
Yeah,
yes,
absolutely.
Because it's a lovely discovery of our human nature. Absolutely. I mean, and it's so inspiring. It's awe-producing, really, when you look at the data, and it opens us up to the totality of our being, which is the point. Why are we here as a human species on this planet at this time, going through the kind of suffering that we all are as a human family? It's because we've forgotten our place in the world.
Absolutely. And I think it's important for us also to have that humility to know that we have so much more to learn and to be open to that and to have that curiosity.
Yes.
Yeah, so true. So what do you think then is the future of medicine?
Well, one, all of these things that we have been dismissive of for so long, things like our so-called placebo effects, which, as you know, I talk about placebo in my book, and I reframe it as holistic elements that activate life force. Because what we know are all these supposed non-specific effects that we dismiss, things like relationship, ritual, expectation, conditioning, our energy. These are actually playing a central role in our health. And so medicine will be transformed when we recognize how important all of these factors are, that they really are the medicine, that we are our own medicine. So when we go to see a practitioner, much like we do maybe when we see an Ayurvedic practitioner, every healthcare encounter will first of all include an assessment of every aspect of your life, your relationships, your place of residence, the environment around you, your diet, your emotional state, right? And they'll be seen as really strong factors that help the doctor to understand, where is your trajectory of health going? I also see that with our work with the Biofield, we'll be able to help not only doctors assess where a person's energetic imbalances may be at a particular time. Again, similar to what we do in Ayurveda, where we look at the phenotype and the pulse and the tongue, right? But also that each of us will be more empowered and have the tools that we need to tap into our own energy and assess it, even without the need for technology, right? Simply say, where is my values balance right now, right?
Yes, indeed.
How are my different flows of prana flowing in the body, and how can I, work with pranayama or some other practice right now to balance and harmonize those flows in the body? And so I mentioned this in the book. In some ways, the future of medicine is going back to the future so that we're really coming full circle. Yeah. And we can have these fun toys. We can create new technologies. There is a language there that people enjoy. They like to see things up on the screen. That's great. So the future is that we can have those toys, but ultimately it still comes back to our consciousness.
Yes, which I think is very empowering, because people will be an integral part of their health and making good decisions and good rituals every day and good eating habits and so on.
Yes. And finally, maybe one of the other interesting things that we might see in the future of medicine that is maybe a little different from the way it has been in the past is an ability for each person to reach deeply and connect with spirit for healing, right? Where we don't have to necessarily go to a shaman, again, as someone outside of ourselves, but we can bring to bear all these beautiful practices that have been shared with us across millennia so that we can more deeply reach and connect with our own spiritual guidance, our own souls, to foster the healing that needs to take place.
Absolutely beautifully put. Well, Dr. Jain, it's just fantastic the work you're doing. I think it's happening your book came out at the perfect time when we're really needing to integrate these practices and to help heal our world and heal ourselves. So can you tell people where they can go to find out more about you, your book, and this wonderful collaborative that you're CEO of, the Consciousness and Healing Initiative?
Absolutely. Well, the easiest way is probably go to healingourselvesbook.com. If you go to healingourselvesbook.com, I offer some fun bonuses. You can buy the book anywhere. The book is called Healing Ourselves, Biofield Science and the Future of Health. And it's, freely available on all the major platforms, including independent bookstores and, Goodreads and thrift books, but also Amazon and Target and Barnes & Noble, all of those places. But if you go to healingourselvesbook.com, you'll get some free bonuses when you sign up there. And that'll take you to my personal website where you'll see a lot of the teaching that I'm doing this year. We have some really great events that we're going to be teaching for those who may want to travel out here to the States. I don't have any Europe dates yet, but I will be teaching in Sedona with Greg Braden and Bruce Lipton and Anita Morjani, and Bruce and I are going to be teaching some in November.
Great.
Lots of really fun events going on. I'm actually teaching in the Bahamas in February as well. So that going to healingourselvesbook.com will take you to my website, and then you'll find a jumping off point to Qi there. But if you'd like to go directly, I deeply encourage everyone to join us at the Consciousness and Healing Initiative.
Sounds fantastic.
We're a community, and they just have to go to chi.is, chi.is. We have free webinars with luminaries every month. We're about to launch a Science of Healing Summit with the Shift Network, which will air in the end of February. And we have courses coming out soon. Lots of wonderful ways to engage, both on the free level, and the more deeply engaged level. It's really something that's for everyone. And we have a lot of people internationally. So welcome anybody who's listening to come and join us there.
Wonderful. And I love that you have such a diverse group of people, from scientists, health practitioners, educators, and artists. I think that's fantastic.
Yeah, it's so much fun. It really is.
Yeah, I'll definitely be checking it out. Well, Dr. Jain, thank you so much for taking time to chat with me today.
Thank you, Colette. It's been a pleasure.
I hope you enjoyed that conversation with Dr. Jain, and please check out the show notes for all those links that Dr. Jain mentioned there. And also in the show notes, you'll find the link to my upcoming discounted digestive group cleanse starting January 21st. And you can also just visit my website, elementshealingandwellbeing.com. If you think that this episode will be helpful to family or friends, please share it with them so we can spread this wisdom. And if you haven't already followed or subscribed to the podcast, please do so. The new episodes will automatically download for you. And if you would like to rate and review the podcast, I would really appreciate that. Also, be sure to check out the Elements social pages on Instagram and Facebook, and you'll find us under Elements Healing and Wellbeing. Thank you so much for tuning in, and until next time, take good care of yourself, be well, and bye for now. Slán go fóill.